Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Crisp Peach Cobbler. That's right, we've done peach cobblers before, but never a crisp peach cobbler. And if you're wondering why didn't I just call it a peach crisp? Well, I couldn't have, because that's what we call peach crumbles. I know, it is a little confusing. But what's not confusing is just how absolutely gorgeous and delicious this comes out. And as advertised, very crisp. So let's go ahead and get started with the topping. And the first step here is we're going to smear together some butter with some white sugar, which is super easy if your butter's room temperature, but mine was not. It was still pretty cold. But that's fine. If you forget to take yours out of the fridge like I did, it will still work. It's just going to take you a lot longer. And this step will be significantly more annoying. But once we get it broken up, and the sugar kind of warms up the butter a little, it'll start to smear together. And eventually, about 4 to 5 minutes later, it should come together and look something like this. All right, basically a sugary, buttery paste. And then once that's been accomplished, what we'll do is go ahead and add some rolled oats, as well as some self-rising flour, which as you know is just regular flour with baking powder and some salt in it. And as usual, I will give you those measurements on the blog. And then we're basically just going to repeat the last step by smearing and smushing this stuff into the butter-sugar mixture. And as you may have noticed, I've switched to a wooden spoon, which is a little more sturdy than the rubber spatula I was using. Never be afraid to switch tools, especially when you're cooking. But no matter what utensil you're using, we're going to basically do the same thing. We'll just keep working that flour and oats into the butter and sugar until we have something that sort of resembles breadcrumbs. And speaking of switching to easier tools, feel free to use your electric mixer for this. But you know what, it's summer, and I want to look good in a tight t-shirt. So I decided to do this by hand, get a little bit of a workout. Very little, but a workout nonetheless. But anyway, like I said, we will mix that together until we have something that resembles breadcrumbs. At which point we will add the last ingredient, some whole milk. Or of course a milk-like substitute. So we'll go ahead and pour that in and give it a mix. And at first it's going to seem kind of dry and crumbly, like something went wrong. But just keep stirring, and you'll see, it'll kind of soften up. And eventually, after a minute or two of stirring, you should have something that looks like this. Alright, sort of a very thick but spreadable batter. So that's looking pretty good. And what we'll do is just set that aside while we prep our peaches. Which is going to be extra easy this time, because we're not going to make you peel them. So all we're going to do is take a knife and split these in half. And to do that, we'll simply cut in until the knife hits the stone. And you can really go in anywhere, but I generally try to look for natural cleavage and slice in right there. And if we cut down to the stone and just slice all the way around, by twisting the two halves, that should come apart just like that. And we'll go ahead and pull out the stone. And then what we'll do once our peach is halved is cut each half into 4 pieces, which if my math's correct, that'll give us 8 total. And by the way, if the skins are going to bother you, you certainly can peel these. But for me, they don't affect the taste and texture, and I think make the final color come out even more beautiful. Not to mention, I bet it's more nutritious with them, which of course is the main reason you eat a peach cobbler. But anyway, that's up to you. You guys are the teachers of your peaches. But whether you peel them or not, once those are transferred into our buttered baking dish, we'll go ahead and apply some freshly grated lemon zest over the top, from exactly 1 fresh lemon. And then once that's been accomplished, we'll go ahead and cut that in half and squeeze over the juice. And believe it or not, that's going to be it for the peach filling. We don't need any cornstarch, we don't need any sugar. And then before we spread over our topping, what I like to do is just settle these down, which I could have just done with my fingers. But whenever I can feature the freakishly small wooden spoon, I do. But anyway, we'll give that a quick once over to make sure everything's sort of settled evenly. And we'll even give it a little bit of a gentle pressing. At which point we can go ahead and transfer on our topping, just sort of plopping it here and there. And then we'll switch to a butter knife to do the final spreading. And as far as tips go here, there aren't any. Just spread it over. Don't overthink it. As long as the top is covered and it's fairly even, you did a good job. And then once our batter's been applied to the top, we have 2 things left to do. We are going to very generously sprinkle white sugar all over the top. And then once we have our sugar applied, things get a little bit weird. And by weird, I mean wet. Because the last step here is to thoroughly moisten the top, which I'm going to do with a spray bottle, but you could do that by dripping over with a pastry brush, or your fingertips, or even a spoon would work. Oh, and by the way, if you use a squirt gun, please put some fresh water in there. The stuff in there is probably from last summer. But anyway, one way or another, we're going to wet the top thoroughly, which is not that easy to see from this angle. So let's go for a little bit of backlighting so you can see just how much you need to apply. There we go. And once our topping's been sugared and moistened, we're now ready to bake. So let's go ahead and transfer that into the center of a 375-degree oven for about 45 minutes or so, or until the top is beautifully browned. And if everything's gone according to plan, it should look something like this. And sure, it's gorgeous and looks crispy, but is it really crispy? Well, as you know, fork don't lie. Oh yeah. So thanks to that little sugar water trick we did before we put it in, this thing develops literally a glass-like crust. So that was the good news. The bad news is we can't eat this for a while. I think we need to let this cool at least a half hour to fully enjoy it. So I let mine cool about 30 minutes or so before I grabbed a spoon to see how I did. And above and beyond the amazing texture, I just absolutely love how this tastes. I mean, as you saw, the filling was incredibly simple, just peaches and lemon. But when you combine it with that crispy cobbler topping and that little bit of oatmeal, we have just an absolutely beautiful thing to eat. And it probably is more than good enough just to eat out of the dish like this. But if you're a real player, we'll go ahead and transfer that into a bowl and maybe top it with some vanilla ice cream. And that, my friends, at least for me, is like summer in a bowl. And I know I probably use that expression for like half a dozen summer recipes, but in this case I mean it the most. Oh, and I should mention as you're eating this, you're probably going to forget you didn't peel the peaches, because you really don't notice anything texturally. And that pigment from the skin has actually given our syrup a beautiful rosy color. So not only did we save time, it actually made it look better. But anyway, that's it. What I'm calling Crisp Peach Cobbler. I'm not sure if it's going to be this upcoming 4th of July holiday, or some other occasion this summer. But at some point you're going to be expected to bring something to share. And this could, and probably should, be that thing. I mean, come on, you can't keep showing up with a bag of chips. I mean, that's okay sometimes. But you gotta step up your game if you want to get invited to the good picnics. And this would help. So I really do hope you give this a try soon. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Peach pie. That's right, originally this was just going to be a demo on how to do that incredibly difficult, almost impossible lattice design for the top, but this peach pie filling came out so good I figured I'd show you that too. In the business we call that value added. And since we are going to cover so much, we better get this peach pie party started right now. So step one, we're going to prep our peaches. And not just any peaches, make sure you get this kind. They're called Freestone. And I actually had to tear one open at the market to make sure it was the right one. And this is how you'll know. If you break it open, that pit, that seed, that nut, whatever it is, will come right out. So make sure you get that kind of peach. Otherwise, this will become a nightmare. And of course, I totally bruised that peach trying to break it open. So instead, you're going to use a knife. Just go around the center like this. That stone's actually going to stop the knife as you cut around. So there shouldn't be that big of a chance you slicing open your palm. And once that's cut, just give it a twist, and that stone will come out quite easily, allegedly. All right, once you do get a grip, it's pretty easy. And then besides getting rid of that stone, we're also going to want to peel these. And I'm just going to use a potato peeler. That works fine, especially if your peaches are really firm like mine were. And if your peaches are too ripe to peel, you can also dip them in boiling water to get the skin off. But we'll talk about that on the blog. And then once those peaches are pitted and peeled, we're going to go ahead and slice them up. Now, generally people try to do wedges with these, but I'm not into wedges. I like to cut it down the center like this, and then just cut across into nice slices. I just think it's much harder for the average home pie maker to get even wedges versus even slices. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and slice up my peaches and toss those in a bowl. And then we're going to do a little extra additional optional step, which includes adding a tiny, tiny pinch of salt to this and half the sugar, about a half a cup of sugar. And I'm going to stir that in. And what's going to happen here, we're going to let this sit for about 20-30 minutes. And that sugar is going to draw liquid from that fruit. And what we'll do is we'll reduce those juices, which ultimately will reduce our risk of getting the dreaded watery pie. So we're going to mix that up. We're going to let it sit for about 20 minutes, 30 minutes, after which you're going to be amazed at how much juice comes out. Check it out. So what we'll do is we'll toss that in a strainer that's over a saucepan, let it sit for about 5 minutes, and then we'll simply place those juices on the stove on medium-high heat and reduce it down to a syrup. And as soon as that stuff reduces and looks like this, simply turn it off and reserve till needed. That's it. Okay, so that's set and it's on to the rest of the filling. So at this point, let's go ahead and mix the rest of the dry ingredients, which is the rest of the sugar, some flour, and a little bit of cornstarch. And then we'll take our whisk and give that a quick stir to kind of mix it all together. And that's it for that step. And we'll move on to the final phase of the peach filling. So believe it or not, I'm going to season mine up with a tiny, tiny pinch of cayenne. No one's going to know it's there, but it will amplify those flavors a little bit. We'll also do a few drips of fresh lemon juice, and then the tiniest, tiniest pinch of cinnamon. All right, we want our guests to suspect there might be cinnamon in there, but they don't know for sure. All right, that would be the perfect amount. And then we can go ahead and dump in the dry ingredients and give that a thorough mixing. And then once that's mixed, our filling's pretty much done, except don't forget, we have to reintroduce that syrup we made. So we'll pour that in, and we'll mix that up, and that fairly simple but incredibly delicious filling is done. And it's time to move on to the real point of the video, how to do a lattice crust. So you're going to need your standard 2-crust pie dough recipe. And of course, half the dough is going to go down into the bottom of the pie dish, and you'll make sure that's all pressed in good and very even, and definitely coming up over the edges of the dish. And then we'll go ahead and dump in our filling, and just take a spoon and kind of even it out. And once you've done that, I highly, highly recommend we give it the old tappa and the old shaka. We really want to settle that filling down. And once that's set, it's ready for the lattice top. So we're going to take that second half of the dough, but instead of just laying it over like that, we're going to cut it into like 1-inch strips. And once those are cut, we can start laying them over the pie. But first, we have to dot with butter. So we're going to take about 1.5 tablespoons of butter, just cut it or break it into small pieces and scatter that over the top, as even as you can get it. And here, in an effort to make it more even, I grabbed a knife and tried to use that, which made things much worse, so don't do that step. But it really doesn't matter, that butter's going to melt into all those cracks and crevices anyway. And then once that butter's down, it is safe to start the latticing. So what I want you to do is lay down 5 strips, just like this. Obviously, you're using the longer ones in the middle, and the shorter ones as you get to the outside. And once those 5 strips have been placed, we're ready to start weaving. And to do that, we're going to fold every other strip back halfway. So it's going to be that strip, and that strip. And let me turn the pie this way so you get a better look. And then we'll lay 1 dough strip across the center like that. And then to make the weave pattern, all we have to do is take the strips that were folded back and fold those over the new piece. And then the 3 pieces of dough that weren't folded over simply get flipped back over that new piece. It actually sounds way more complicated than it is. And then we're just going to repeat the process with another strip of dough. So lay a strip down. We'll flip those 3 over. We'll flip those other 2 strips back. All right, so you get the idea. And then we'll simply continue that process. So we'll lay another strip of dough down. That one gets flipped over. That one gets flipped over. And now we just have 1 to flip back. And we'll go ahead and put our final strip for that side in and fold that last piece over, and that half of the pie is done. And then you're simply going to repeat for the other half. So basically what this comes down to is laying strips down and figuring out which ones to flip over, which isn't that hard, because if you pick the wrong one, it's pretty obvious. So not too complicated, you'll figure it out. All right, you're the quarterback here. You got to be the Mark Rippon of your dough strip flipping. So we'll continue weaving until we get to the end. And by the way, always feel free to rewind these videos and watch them like 12 or 15 more times to really get these techniques down. That way you really learn it, and it looks like I have more traffic than I do. So everybody wins. And then once we've completed our lattice weave, you're going to go around and press that dough together, trim off any excess if you have a lot of it. I didn't, so I just kind of folded mine under. And then just to make it look nice, I'm going to go around and crimp the edges. As usual, I'll link to a video of my mom showing you how to do that. And at that point, that's pretty much ready for the oven, except I'm going to give it a little bit of a wash. And in this case, I'm going to use cream. I usually use milk. You can also use egg wash, but I do like milk or cream for this. And then last but not least, let's give this a very generous dusting of white sugar. And that pie's ready for the oven, which has been preheated to 350. And we're going to pop that in the center for about, I don't know, mine took 1 hour and 15 minutes. Yours might take less, yours might take more, but when it's done, it will look like this. It should be beautifully browned and bubbling. And then by far the hardest part of this entire recipe, you have to let this cool before you eat it. I know, I'm upset too, but it really does need time to set up and kind of solidify a little bit. So you really do want to let this cool completely. And if you do, you'll be rewarded with the perfect slice. Check it out. And then do yourself a huge favor and serve this with vanilla ice cream. Although some people like whipped cream, not to be confused with that poisonous whipped topping a lot of you people buy, which you really should stop doing. And as I go in with the fork, you can see that perfect filling texture, tender and very juicy, but absolutely no wateriness, which I think we have that little optional step at the beginning to thank for, reducing those juices. And this video was already too long, but I had like another 2 minutes of me eating this pie footage. It was that good, I couldn't stop eating, okay? So like I said, originally I was just going to show you the lattice top, but the filling came out so good, I figured I'd show you that too. So usually at this point I say I hope you give this a try. But in this case, I have to say I hope you give this and that a try. All right? So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Peach gelée, or gelée, depends on what part of France you're from. What this is a very intense jellied fruit candy, really fun to make. I don't make a lot of candy, but this is one I do enjoy making. So here's how you do it. So I need 1 pound of fresh peach. All right, get something really ripe and sweet. To that, I'm going to add some fresh lime juice. You can use lemon if you want, but I like the lime. So a tablespoon of that. And then we're going to puree that in the blender until very, very, very smooth. Okay? So once that is all pureed, I'm going to add that to a heavy bottom saucepan. Use something good quality. You don't want this scorching on the bottom. All right, I'm going to add a portion of the sugar. I'm going to bring that to a boil on medium-high heat. And we're just going to basically cook this, stirring with a spatula, about 15 minutes until it begins to thicken. Basically, we're evaporating water out of there and concentrating the peach down to like a really thick paste. Now, as this is cooking, you got to be really careful. Peach gelée is a cruel mistress, and it will bubble up and splatter on you and burn you severely. So be very careful. Adjust your flame. You want it boiling, you want it simmering, you want it reducing, but you don't want it going too high where it's actually like splattering out of the pot. All right, so 15 minutes later, mine looked like that. You can see it's like significantly thicker. I'm going to add the rest of the sugar. This is not a fruit salad, it's a candy. So of course we're going to use lots of sugar, and I'm going to stir that in, which will dissolve pretty quickly. And then the last ingredient, liquid pectin. Liquid pectin, that's what's going to really give this that beautiful jelly texture. So once the rest of the sugar's in and the pectin, I'm going to bring that back to a simmer. I want you to get this up to about 205 degrees. And once it gets up there, I want you to cook it for another 10 minutes. And again, I'm stirring with a spatula just like the first time. And 10 minutes later, you're going to have something that looks like this. Now at that point, turn off the heat, you're done. Although I did one extra step here, totally optional. I wanted the color to be a little deeper, a little darker, a little more intense. So I put a couple drops of red food coloring, all natural, which I thought gave it kind of a cool color. You can leave yours natural, doesn't matter. All right, I was just going for something, I don't know, a little peachier. I'm going to pour that into a plastic wrap lined 8x8 baking dish. I'm going to even it out, and we're going to give it the rare combination shaka shaka tappa tappa. That's right, the old tappa tappa along with a shaka shaka. You're welcome. So let it cool to room temperature, wrap it up, refrigerate overnight or until completely firm. All right, takes a while. Once it's refrigerated until firm, I'm going to unwrap. I'm going to dust with sugar. Very important. I'll tell you why in a minute. I'm going to dust the surface, which I'm using a Silpat, silicone baking mat. I'm going to dust that with sugar. I'm going to invert it. So now I got sugar on sugar, which is going to help it not stick. This stuff is sticky. So the sugar will help it glide on the surface. I'm going to carefully peel off the plastic. I'm going to sugar that side. And I'm just using regular white granulated sugar. Once that's sprinkled, I'm going to trim the edges just to make it all, perfect and beautiful. And you can cut these as big or small as you want. I think I did 20, 24 maybe. And that sugar really helps the knife go through. It makes for really cool, clean cuts. And also, it gives it that kind of signature look, the jellied kind of side, and then the sugar top and bottom. And what's even better, after you cut these, all right, and you flip them over, the other side looks really beautiful because it's been sort of pressed in. So once you cut them, flip them over, and they all will look perfect and uniform. Very cool. And that's it. Look at that. Peach gelée, very intense, super concentrated peach flavor, that beautiful jellied, sticky, firm inside, and then that little bit of crispiness from the granulated sugar on the outside. What a great candy. All right, like I said, I don't make a lot of candy, but this is a really nice, fresh fruit-based candy. Perfect time of year to do it, end of summer. So I hope you give that a try. All the specific measurements are on foodwishes.com. You need those. All right, so go check that out. And as always, enjoy. Baltimore peach cake. That's right, everything I know about Baltimore I learned from watching The Wire, which is why I knew very little about this cake. All right, they really didn't talk too much about old German desserts on the show. But nevertheless, when I did find out about this cake, which is really more of a bread, I was very intrigued and decided to give it a try. And what follows is my fairly successful first-time attempt. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with the dough, which we will begin by adding some sugar to this bowl, along with a package of dry active yeast, which we will activate with some very warm but not too hot milk. Okay, something around 95 to 100 degrees. And you can use a thermometer if you want, but I just tested by feeling with my pinky, which I've had calibrated to be accurate within 2 degrees. And then we can go ahead and finish up these wet ingredients with some melted butter, as well as 1 large beaten egg. And that's it. We'll take a whisk and give this a mix. And once we can feel that all that sugar's been dissolved, we can go ahead and add our flour, which generally for things like this, especially when we haven't made them before, we don't want to add all the flour at once. Okay, it's always much easier to add if you need it. And by the way, I'm using all-purpose here, although the word on the street is that traditionally some wheat flour was actually used also. So just something to keep in mind if you're into that kind of thing. So I dumped some in and gave it a stir. And after just a few moments, I could tell it was still super wet. So I went ahead and added in the rest. And continued stirring until it was almost all incorporated. At which point I stopped and added the last ingredient, which is going to be some salt. And yes, I'm pretty sure you could add this right at the beginning, but I'm always getting emails from people that are afraid the salt's going to kill the yeast, and they ask me why I don't add it later in the process. So stirring it in at this point is dedicated to them. Or maybe I just forgot. There's really no way you'll ever know for sure. But anyway, I went ahead and mixed that up until I had a very, very wet and very sticky dough. And at this point I was wondering if it was too wet, and maybe I should add some more flour. But I kept thinking this is called a cake and not a bread, and I do want to keep it on the moist side and do not want it too dry. So I decided to leave it alone. And by leave it alone, I mean cover it with a damp towel and let it sit in a warm spot for about an hour and a half or until it doubles in size. And while we're waiting for that to happen, we can go ahead and prep our peaches. And for that, we will use some classic peach slicing technique, which means first find a seam and cut all the way around like this, and then give it a little twist to separate it into halves. And then once we pull out that stone, we are ready to slice this into whatever size pieces we want, which for me is going to be 4 pieces per half, which is 8 pieces per peach. Oh yeah, Chef John's pretty good at math. Oh, and by the way, go ahead and peel these if you want, but I don't think you should, because I think it looks a lot better if you don't. And once baked, you do not even know those skins are there. And besides, we could probably all use a little extra fiber. But either way, we'll go ahead and slice up 3 or 4 peaches, depending on the size, or until we have enough to cover the top of our dough. Speaking of which, after about an hour and a half, mine had doubled and looked a little something like this. And as I proceeded to deflate this with my spatula, part of my brain was telling me you probably should have added some more flour. This seems a little too wet. But another dumber part of my brain said, you know what, it's probably fine. Just keep going. So I did, and I went ahead and transferred that into a well-buttered baking dish. And what we're going to need to do once that's all been transferred in is take our spatula and attempt to pull it into each corner, and then even it out as best we can. Which for something this elastic and soft and sticky, is going to take you a few minutes. But the good news is, for whatever reason, that was surprisingly satisfying to do. And then what we'll do once that dough has been thoughtfully distributed is cover this in plastic and let it rise for another half hour to 45 minutes, or until it roughly doubles in size again. And approximately 41 minutes later, mine looked like this. At which point we can unwrap it, and we can top the top with peaches. Or if you like less words, we can top with peaches. And of course, we're going to want to make sure those all go in the same direction, so as not to annoy certain people who would be very upset if we had some going one way and some going the other. All right, you know who you are. But anyway, we'll go ahead and place those on as shown, where we have them almost touching, but we can still see a little bit of dough in between. And we'll also want to sort of press those in a little bit, so the surface is relatively flat. And then to finish this up, I went ahead and drizzled and brushed a little bit of melted butter over the top. Maybe more than a little, like a couple tablespoons. And then last but not least, I finished this off by dusting the top with some demerara sugar, which is sort of a large crystal light brown sugar, but just a light sprinkling of regular brown sugar, or regular white sugar, should work the same. And that's it, our Baltimore peach cake is now ready to transfer into the center. of a 375-degree oven for about 40 to 45 minutes, or until nicely browned and cooked through. And by the way, those times I just gave you are what I want you to do, not what I did, which was about 35 minutes. And we'll get to why in a second. But anyway, at this point I assumed this was cooked perfectly, and I even tested with a toothpick, which came out clean, so I thought it was good. But as we'll eventually discuss, that wasn't necessarily the case. But for now, let's forget about that, and just focus on how unbelievably gorgeous this is. I mean, come on, look at that. But not for too long, please. Because if we're going to glaze this with jam, which I am, we want to do that while it's still hot. So what we'll do is take some peach or apricot preserves and heat that up with a little touch of water so it's brushable. And we will go ahead and give the top a very generous glaze, which, by the way, I'm told is kind of controversial. Okay, some folks consider it mandatory, while others will say it's an abomination, which is kind of harsh. But anyway, I'm a glazer from way back, so given the option, I'm always going to go with the glaze over the no glaze. And that's it. Once we have that brushed on, we will simply let this cool all the way down to room temp before we try to serve it, which was not easy, but I did. And then once cooled, I went ahead and cut a slice. And at first glance, I was very excited and thought I had had beginner's luck, and it was perfect. And I have to say that first bite was absolutely delicious. Okay, it was sort of like a peach sweet roll, or a peach cinnamon roll without the cinnamon. But then I realized that the dough directly underneath the fruit hadn't quite cooked enough and was still a little bit doughy, which wasn't necessarily an unpleasant experience, but was a little bit odd texturally. And that will be a lot easier to see when I use the fork here. So yes, next time I think I will add a little more flour, so the dough's a little stiffer. And I'm probably going to leave it in the oven for about 5 to 10 extra minutes. In fact, it was such a moist dough, I probably could have went until the top was almost too brown and then pulled it out. So fair warning, you are probably going to need to adjust this, which is fine, since you are, after all, the Omar Little, of this not being too doughy in the middle. But overall, for a first attempt, I was extremely happy with how this came out. And it really is sort of unique. I mean, it's not a bread or a cake. It's some weird hybrid. But of course, since we are calling it cake, I had to test to see if it would work with ice cream, which it did, by the way. So to summarize, with a few minor tweaks, I think this would be an absolutely fantastic recipe to break out in the middle of peach season. Or even with other fruits like plums or cherries or berries. I really think this would work well with all those things, and more. But anyway, that's it. My first attempt at Baltimore peach cake. Believe it or not, I've heard the original recipe called for sauteed onions on the top as well. And no, I'm not kidding. So if you happen to try that and it works, send me a picture. Otherwise, I'll just finish up by saying, I really do hope you give this a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Spicy peach coleslaw. That's right. I could eat a peach for hours. They're so sweet, juicy, and delicious. But while I do enjoy them in their fresh and natural state, they make a fantastic coleslaw. And yes, this is the side dish you saw with our now famous coffee cola skirt steak recipe. And I promised I would show you, and here we go. All right, so step one, we're going to make our dressing. Very simple. It's going to be a little bit creamy, so we're going to start off with some mayo. To that, we're going to add a little spoon of Dijon mustard. And then for the spicy, I'm going to go with sambal, which is a ground chili paste. Very delicious stuff. That's why I use it in like every other recipe. We're also going to add some rice vinegar and some freshly squeezed lemon juice. We're also going to add some vegetable oil, just a little bit. And then the secret ingredient to all coleslaw recipes, a little bit of sugar. And no, I didn't add any salt at this point. There is some salt in the rice vinegar, and we will adjust later, of course. So just whisk that up until it's thoroughly mixed, and that dressing is ready. So at this point, we're going to move on to our cabbage prep. And I'm going to do like a half a green cabbage. And here is a couple different ways you can shave the cabbage. Sometimes I'll cut the half in half, which makes 2 quarters. I know, thank you, Mr. Math. And then I'll take that quarter piece, and I'll take my knife and just start shaving off that edge, just at a slight angle, just like that. And that will give you some nice fine ribbons. So that's how I usually do it. That works very well. But another alternative method, which may work better if you're not confident with the knife skills, is to take that piece of cabbage and separate it into 3 or 4 layers. And when you take one of those layers, which is maybe 6 or 8 leaves, and press it flat down on the board, that also allows you to slice it thinly fairly easily. All right, because it's not going anywhere, and you can get some nice thin cuts. In the store, they call that angel hair cabbage, but that's only so they can charge more. So yes, you can buy this in the bag, and I do sometimes. But as you can see, it really doesn't take that long to slice up. So either of those two methods will work. But bottom line, we're going to slice up a bowl full of cabbage. All right, so our cabbage is prepped, and it's on to the peaches. So we're going to dice up some peaches. I'm using what's called freestone, which means if you cut around and twist, the fruit comes right off that stone. Much easier to cut. And then each half, I'll just cut in half like that. And then simply cut across one way, cut across the other into a nice dice. Very, very simple. And by the way, the second piece had like a really soft kind of bruised spot. Didn't matter, I cut it anyway, because in a coleslaw it really does not matter. So if your peaches are overly ripe, it still will work. Don't worry. We're going to toss that in with the cabbage. And then I'm going to add a little bit of freshly chopped chives. I'm not a big fan of the raw onion in coleslaw. I think it can overpower the rest of the ingredients. So with chive, you get that little bit of oniony flavor, yet it's much more subtle, much more mild. So I really like it. And that's pretty much it. We're going to take our dressing, pour it over, and we're going to mix it thoroughly. And technically at that point, other than tasting for seasoning, you're done. But I do not think you should eat it right now. For the ultimate spicy peach coleslaw experience, I think we should wrap it and throw it in the fridge for about a half hour to let the flavors develop and also to let that dressing sort of wilt the cabbage just a hair. It's still going to be crunchy, it's still going to be firm, but it's just going to be a little more fork friendly. There's nothing worse than a fork unfriendly coleslaw. I mean, how am I supposed to eat it? So that's really up to you. You have to legislate your own coleslaws. So I let mine sit for a half hour in the fridge, and then a half hour later I pulled it out, and it looked like this. So you can see it just softened ever so slightly. Like I said, just works a little better on the fork. At this point I'm going to taste and adjust for seasoning. As I thought, it needed a little bit of salt and a little bit of cayenne. It was spicy enough, but I knew if I didn't put cayenne, some of you wouldn't be able to sleep tonight. Even with that, some of you will still have trouble. So a little bit of cayenne. One final mixing, and that's it. Dish it up. Your spicy peach coleslaw is done. I'm going to transfer that into a slightly more attractive dish, maybe sprinkle a few more chives on top, and that is one delicious summer side dish. And really, I don't know why peaches aren't used in coleslaw more often. They are so perfect in it. Just adds that little bit of extra sweetness and juiciness that works so well with the coleslaw and that spicy dressing. Oh, and by the way, I exaggerated that I could eat a peach for hours. Like really, half hour tops. But still, that's pretty good. But anyway, if you're not going to eat the peach fresh right out of your hand, this is another beautiful use for what many people consider the ultimate summer fruit. Okay? So I hope you give that a try. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Fried peach and pancetta pizza. That's right, we're doing fried pizza. Which I was going to call fritza, but then I was afraid people would think that meant fruit pizza, and there would have been massive confusion, so we're not going to do that. And believe it or not, this was inspired by a childhood dessert, because my family used to take leftover pizza dough scraps, and they'd fry it and toss it in sugar to make like a quick donut-like treat. But here we're going to take that same idea and turn it into a savory application. So I'm going to go ahead and get started by cooking some pancetta. So in a cold skillet, I have a big handful of some thickly sliced pancetta, and I am going to add a little drizzle of olive oil to get things started. And we'll go ahead and put that on medium heat and cook it until we have something very nicely caramelized. And all pancetta is a cured pork. They call it Italian bacon, but it isn't smoked, so the flavor is not really bacon-like, but just absolutely delicious nonetheless. And like I said, we're going to cook that until it's fairly well caramelized. So here we're starting to get there. So I let this go a couple more minutes until I had something that resembled this. And at that point, all I want you to do is turn off the heat and let that cool right in the pan. Because when we use this to top our pizzas, we do want a little bit of that oil coming along for the ride, okay? So we'll turn off the heat, we'll leave that right there, and we'll move on to the pizza dough. So yes, you're going to need some prepared pizza dough, and I'm going to cut that in quarters because I'm going to make little small pizzas. And we'll take one of those pieces and we'll dust it with flour. And as with anything like this, we just want to use enough flour so we can work with it. Don't put too much flour. All right, don't be afraid of a little stickiness. And then all we want to do is roll this out and or stretch it with our hands to get it about 1/8 of an inch thick. So I kind of use a combination of pulling and stretching and rolling. And please don't be concerned about shape. Really, the beauty of this thing is any shape's going to be perfect, except for a perfect circle. Perfect will look stupid. I mean, that imperfect shape is one of the things that makes us look awesome. Kind of like people. But anyway, like I said, we're going to roll that out to about 1/8 of an inch thick. And when it gets to this point, I kind of like to finish off by just stretching it with my fingertips. There should be just enough stickiness to kind of make it adhere and sort of keep it stretched out like that. So that looks good. And at that point, just let it sit there and rest for about 5 minutes before we go ahead and fry this in olive oil. So I'm going to use a heavy cast iron skillet set on medium-high heat. And we're just going to shallow fry this. There's only about a ½ inch of olive oil in there. And we'll carefully place that dough in. Pro tip, don't burn yourself. Always place it in a way that if it splashes away from you. And we're going to fry that for about 2 minutes per side, or until it's nicely browned and cooked through. And you're going to see both sides are going to have a very distinctive look. So I'm going to flip this over, and the side that went down first is going to be quite browned around the outside, but the center is going to be kind of light. But don't worry, that's where our toppings are going to go. So that will be the top. And then this other side, as you'll see, is going to pretty much brown across the whole surface. So that looks good. And like I said, it's going to take about 2 minutes per side, give or take. But you'll know because it'll look like this. And then what we'll do is we'll drain that very well on paper towels. And at that point, your fried pizza dough is ready for toppings. And one cool thing about this is you can do this step ahead, even the day before if you want. And we'll talk about that on the blog. But I'm not doing this ahead. I want to eat right now. So I'm going to go ahead and transfer those onto a foil-lined baking sheet. Again, we want to make sure we have that lighter side up, the concave side up, the convex side down, and we will begin to build our pizza. So I'm going to start by spreading these with some beautiful ricotta cheese. Don't put too much, but make sure you got enough. Okay, I'm recommending the perfect amount here. And then once these have been cheesed, I'm going to do a little bit of fresh herb. In this case, I'm using fresh thyme leaves. Basil is also fantastic. So if you want something a little bit on the sweeter side, go basil. And if you'd rather have a little more on the savory, herbaceous side, go with the thyme. And not too much, just a hint. And then we'll go ahead and grab our pancetta, which should be now cool enough to handle. And we'll go ahead and scatter that over the top. And again, you don't want too much, but you do want some pancetta in every bite. So make sure you distribute that thoughtfully. And please note I'm using nice thick slices of pancetta because you really want that nice porky bite here, something to sink your teeth into. And by the way, there's nothing porkier than pancetta. But anyway, that looks pretty good right there. And then when you're cooking, you always want to listen to yourself. Because as I was looking at these, I said to myself, you should put a little black pepper on there. So I did. And at that point, it was time for the other main ingredient, beautiful, fresh, ripe, incredibly sweet peaches. We're going to take a few slices and nuzzle them in. Actually, I said nuzzle. I actually meant nestle. But now that I think about it, nuzzle works. And I'm kind of trying to position these where they're covering up the minimum amount of pancetta. So I'm kind of going in between the chunks, but that's not a big deal. It's going to taste incredible regardless. So I'm going to go with 5 nice slices. That's what looks like it works here. But anyway, that's up to you. You are the Mother Teresa of your fried pizza. And then once that stone fruit has been placed down, I'm going to top it with a fairly generous grating of Parmigiano Reggiano. And by generous, I mean about 10 to 12 cents worth. And then last but not least, before these go in the oven, I'm going to give them a little drizzle of extra virgin olive oil. This time we're using the good stuff. And then we'll go ahead and pop those in a very hot oven, 475, for about 12 to 15 minutes, or until it looks like this. It should be beautifully browned. All right, you may see a little bit of caramelization happening on the cheese. And those peaches will be perfectly tender. And I'm sorry if it sounds like I'm patting my own butt, but those really do look amazing. I mean, come on, how do you not want to eat that? Although, and you knew this was coming, you really should let those cool for about 5 or 10 minutes. I mean, if you eat this too hot, you just don't get the full effect. So let it cool a little bit, and at that point, go ahead and pop it on a plate. If you have the time, and you have the time, you can go ahead and accessorize with a couple extra sprigs, and that fried peach and pancetta pizza is done. And I was going to say something else, but I forgot what that was, because I want to eat this. So let me go ahead and cut this in half, and dig in to what ended up being one of the most delicious things I've eaten all month. That subtly sweet, rich ricotta, that beautifully caramelized porky pancetta, which always has that little hint of cured funkiness to it. And of course those sweet peaches and Parmesan and thyme and black pepper and olive oil. Just a magnificent array of flavors. And I want to be clear, there's absolutely nothing wrong with regular pizza, just like there's nothing wrong with boiled potatoes. But sometimes you want french fries. You know what I'm saying? So I really do hope you give this a try. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Grilled prosciutto-wrapped peaches with burrata and basil. That's right, please don't let that long name fool you. The ingredient list is short and the results were stunning. And by the way, I think I'm going to do a new thing where when I come back from vacation, the first video I post is going to be of the most delicious thing I had during the break. And this was that, which really is saying something, since about 95% of my vacations are spent eating delicious things. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started with the teaches of peaches. And in today's lesson, we're going to focus on how to remove the stone and cut these up. So what we'll want to do is take a sharp knife and carefully cut straight in until we feel that blade hit the stone. And once that happens, we'll just slice it all the way around like this. And then if we give those two halves a twist, they should separate easily. And then once that's been accomplished, we'll just pull out that stone, and that's all there is to it. And by the way, there's no need to peel these. Just leave the peel on. They're going to look better, they're going to taste better, plus the extra nutrients in that skin are going to cancel out the negative effects from the pork fat. Oh yeah, it's the perfect system. But anyway, we're going to cut those in half and remove the stone, at which point we can cut these into any size we want. So I'm going to go ahead and cut these halves in half. So I'm going to get 4 pieces per peach, which is going to give me a size I think works best on the grill. But if you happen to be using giant peaches, possibly from your friend James, then maybe you cut each half in thirds to get 6 per peach. That kind of thing's going to be up to you. But ultimately, you do want to end up with something about this size. And then once our peach pieces have been prepped, they're ready to wrap with prosciutto and poke. So before we start, we're going to want to soak some bamboo skewers or toothpicks in some water so those don't catch on fire on the grill. And then all we're going to do is wrap each piece with a strip of prosciutto, and we'll wrap that around a few times and secure it with our skewer. So a very simple operation. And of course, you can put on as much prosciutto as you want. I have done these before where I've wrapped them completely in the ham, and they are delicious, but I do prefer if some of the peach is poking out both ends. And yes, if you want, you can put on more than one per skewer, but I thought I would have a little more control doing them individually, but it also turned out to be kind of a pain, as you'll see. Nothing major, although next time I'll probably just use smaller toothpicks. But anyway, we are going to wrap and skewer those peaches as we see fit, at which point we will transfer those onto a plate and head out to the grill. And ideally, you're going to char grill these, so you get that little bit of smokiness. And yes, of course, you can use a gas grill. They just won't taste quite as good. But anyway, we're going to place those down and simply grill them for a few minutes per side until our prosciutto kind of crisps up a little bit and our peach warms through and those edges get a little bit caramelized. And as I mentioned earlier, I probably would just use regular toothpicks next time, as these longer bamboo skewers were a little awkward to use on the grill. But you know what? I really do hate to complain about something that wasn't really a problem. So somehow, some way, I was able to flip those around until, like I said, that prosciutto got a little bit crispy around the edges and that gorgeous juicy fruit started to heat through. And by the way, please note when you're wrapping these, don't worry about being perfect. As you may be able to see, any of those little torn, scraggly pieces of prosciutto, those are the bits that are going to get extra caramelized and make this look and taste even better. So if you do see a little piece of ham here or there, getting a little dark, a little golden black, don't worry, everything's going to be fine. Just stay calm and grill on. And of course, some are going to finish before others, so when you think they're good, pull them off. And once all our prosciutto-wrapped peaches have been successfully grilled, we will head back inside for final assembly. Now, before we plate up, I should mention you could totally serve it just like this. Those would make a very handsome appetizer, maybe drizzled with a little bit of olive oil. So if you are lactose intolerant or just lactose indifferent, that is an option, but not for me. I'm going to go ahead and pull out these skewers so we can plate this up as follows. We are going to take a nice big scoop of burrata cheese. And if you haven't had the pleasure, burrata is an extra creamy, extra rich form of mozzarella. I know it almost looks more like ricotta, but it's not. And we will talk a little bit about burrata on the blog post, since it really is something you want to introduce into your life. And then once our cheese is down, we will surround that with our still warm, absolutely gorgeous looking grilled prosciutto-wrapped peaches. And then we'll finish off with a nice drizzle of extra virgin olive oil. Not too much, but a little sprinkling will help tie all this together. And then I'm going to give this a nice sprinkling of sea salt. And as you'll notice, I'm using something that has nice large flakes so we can see it and feel it. And then we'll also do a little touch of freshly ground black pepper, just a couple grinds. And then last but not least, a little chiffonade of fresh basil. And for whatever reason, if you're not into basil, some fresh thyme, in particular some lemon thyme, would be very nice with this. But that's up to you. You are the peaches and herb of your peaches and herb. And as good as this looks, and you gotta admit, it looks pretty good, the combination of taste and textures here is just off the charts. I mean, we have that salty ham wrapping that sweet, juicy fruit, both of which have been kissed by that smoky grill. And when you pair that with that extra creamy, extra rich, extra decadent mozzarella, you have something that's beyond fantastic. And by the way, just in case you're wondering, this is technically an appetizer, if I had to pick a category. But this would make an incredibly interesting savory style dessert. Oh, if it's summer and peaches are ripe, I would take this over a slice of pie any day. But anyway, that's it. Prosciutto-wrapped grilled peaches with burrata. Like I said, I was just off for a week and had countless things that were incredibly delicious, but none more so than this. So I really do hope you give this a try. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Peaches and cream. That's right, I'm going to show you how to make what might be the ultimate summer dessert. But that's not all. I'm also going to show you how not to make it. Since even though this recipe is perfect as is, it needed absolutely no improvement, I attempted to do a new variation, which at the time I thought was pretty genius and was going to be amazing, but it actually ended up being none of those things. So officially, I'm glad I tried, but unofficially, I don't know what the heck I was thinking. So with that, let's go ahead and get started by prepping our peach. And we will start that by finding the crease in the skin. And we'll cut in right there until our knife hits the pit. And we'll go ahead and cut all the way around, as if we were doing an avocado. And then hopefully just by twisting, the peach will come apart into two halves. And if it does like this, that means it's called a freestone peach. And we will go ahead and pull out the stone. And by the way, if it doesn't do that, it's called a clingstone peach. And you can still use it, it's just not quite as easy. But anyway, we'll go ahead and remove the pit and cut a slice. And I'll go ahead and trim off the skin, which I guess you could leave on there if you're into something more nutritional, or you just enjoy edible fur. But I'm going to go ahead and remove it. And no, we're not going to do that a slice at a time. I'm just doing this so I could take a taste, to see exactly how sweet this is. Because if it is super sweet, we don't have to do the sugar syrup step. And this piece was good, but it wasn't super sweet. But anyway, after we've tasted for ripeness and sweetness, we'll go ahead and peel off the skin and slice this up. And yes, there is a technique where you dip these in boiling water to peel the skin off, but I'm just going to go ahead and peel the half as shown. And then we'll go ahead and slice that up as thick as we want. And then so I have a little more of a bite-sized piece, I'm going to go ahead and cut these slices in half. And that's it. That's exactly how we're going to prep our peach. So I went ahead and did a couple of those off camera. And once our peach is prepped, we can move on to making our simple syrup, which is done by combining 2 parts sugar with 1 part cold fresh water. And what we'll do is set that over medium-high heat and possibly give it the old shaka. And what's going to happen is this is going to start to boil, and the sugar will disappear and the mixture will turn clear. And once we have that bubbling, we're going to let it cook for exactly 3 minutes before very carefully transferring in our peaches. And like I mentioned, if you taste your peach and it is just so syrupy sweet, then you really do not have to do this step. But the ultra-ripe, super perfect sweet peach is a rare thing. So generally for this, I do recommend doing this extra step. And then what we'll do once all that's been stirred together is just leave it on the heat for like 1 more minute, or until we see our liquid start to bubble again, at which point we will remove that from the heat and transfer it into a bowl to cool. And that's it. Once those do cool down, they are pretty much ready to use. And then traditionally, once this is cooled, we would combine it with regular heavy cream to finish what is one of the greatest desserts of all time. But that is not what I did, because I think I'm smart and creative. I decided to reinvent the wheel. And what follows is my tragic attempt to make something that's already perfect better. And what I did was add some heavy cream to the saucepan, along with some white sugar, and I stirred that together over medium-high heat, and waited for it to start to simmer. And the reason I was doing all this is because I know from past experience, if you cook cream for a little while with some sugar, and then stir in some lemon juice, once it's cold, it will actually thicken up. And I thought that slightly thicker, little bit sweeter cream would be way better with the peaches, which it was most certainly not. But anyway, like I said, I brought that to a simmer and let it cook for about 3 minutes or so before pulling it off the heat, at which point I went ahead and stirred in about 2 teaspoons of lemon juice. And that's it. I simply waited for both of my components to cool down a little bit before putting them together. And once that happened, I went ahead and used a slotted spoon to transfer some peaches into my serving glass. And I used the slotted spoon because I do want a little bit of that sugar syrup in with it, but not too much. And then once I determined I had a perfect portion of peaches, I went ahead and filled that up with my cooked cream mixture. And I have to say, at this point, I was pretty proud of myself. I was like, you know what, Chef John? You really are a smart guy. By heating that cream, you've created something that's going to be even richer and more luxurious and way more delicious, probably. And because I was so sure this was going to be fantastic, I actually ended up doing 4. So I went ahead and wrapped those up and popped them in the fridge until they were thoroughly chilled. And while I was waiting, I decided to take all the rest of the leftover juices and add that to a pan and reduce it down until it thickened up a little bit, since I thought that would make a beautiful drizzle for the top. So that's what I did. And once that had reduced by about half, I went ahead and turned off the heat and simply let it cool. Oh, and if you're looking for an insanely delicious ice cream topping, keep this little trick in mind. But anyway, once my peaches and creams were chilled, I went ahead and pulled one out and went ahead and spooned over some of our now chilled peach syrup. Which as I was doing, I thought to myself, that does not look that great. Which in the movie business is known as foreshadowing. But anyway, I syruped the top and grabbed a spoon to dig in and was thoroughly disappointed. Okay, it didn't look that bad. It actually looked pretty good. But my idea for making the cream thicker and slightly sweeter was not a good one. Okay, not only did it kind of clash texturally with the peaches, but also the fact that that cream had sugar in it really sort of took away the natural sweetness of the peach. So to summarize, by trying to do more, we ended up with less. Which in hindsight seems obvious now, and I really should have known. But for some reason the universe forced me to go through this exercise. To, I guess, build character? And of course, since there's no accounting for taste, some of you might actually like this. But compared to the classic approach, I did not. And I officially deemed this recipe a food wish failure. But as you know, we never let the food win. So I whipped up another batch of peaches, which actually ended up being even sweeter and more orange. But I did the same thing with the simple syrup. And I used a slotted spoon to transfer some into this bowl, where we are going to add an equal amount of pure heavy cream. Not cooked, not sweetened, just good old-fashioned cold heavy cream. And that, my friends, is how you actually make peaches and cream. But don't try to eat it quite yet. This stuff is way better if we wrap it up and pop it in the fridge for a few hours to get really cold, and also to give that cream time to absorb all those beautiful peach flavors. At which point then we can pull it out and possibly drizzle over a little of that optional syrup. And as I finished this up, I was already feeling a lot better. And my earlier frustration faded away, replaced by anticipation for how amazing this was going to be. And it really, really was. Right, that combination between the sweet, sticky peaches and the thinner, unsweetened but still rich, heavy cream really is what makes this dessert so extraordinary. And by the way, no, we didn't forget any ingredients. To me, this is not something you want to add things like cinnamon or vanilla to. Okay, for this, I really don't think we want anything else getting in the way. But of course, having said that, you decide. You are, after all, the queen of your peaches and cream. And whatever pleases your highness is fine with us. But anyway, that's it. Peaches and cream. I think we all learned something here today, which is if you're going to do a video to improve a recipe, pick a recipe that actually needs improving. Like cauliflower pizza crust. And not an iconic, already perfect recipe like peaches and cream. So lesson learned. And in keeping with the simple theme of this recipe, I will finish up by simply saying, I really do hope you give this a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Peach Financiers. That's right, we're doing Financiers, which I believe is French for loan shark. And these delicious little almond cakes get their name because they're rich and they look like gold bars. Well, actually, they're supposed to look like gold bars if you have the traditional rectangular molds to make them in, which you don't, and neither do I. So we'll be using little mini muffin pans instead. But geometric issues aside, this is a very easy recipe, and it's going to work beautifully with pretty much any summer fruit. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with step 1, which is browning the butter. So in a saucepan over medium heat, we're going to melt a little bit of butter. And our butter's going to melt, and then it's going to get foamy, and eventually it will be bubbling enthusiastically like this. And we want to keep toasting it, like I said, over medium heat to a beautiful golden brown. And by the way, it's not really the butter fat that's toasting, it's the milk solids in the butter. So that's what we're keeping our eye on. And by swirling it, you should get a pretty good look. And we want to keep toasting it until it looks like this. Just a beautiful golden brown. And at that point, we're going to turn off the heat and just let it sit there for about 10 minutes while we put together the rest of the batter, which starts with separating 3 eggs. And for this, we're just going to use the whites, but don't throw away the yolks. And what am I going to use those for? What am I not going to use them for? That didn't sound quite as creepy in my head. But anyway, we'll save those for a custard or something. And then to our egg whites, we're going to add some white sugar. And we're going to take a whisk and kind of stir and beat this thoroughly. And no, don't worry, we're not trying to make a meringue here. I know many of you are terrified of meringues for some reason. And what's going to happen over the course of the next couple minutes is that sugar is going to dissolve, and those egg whites are going to get kind of thick and foamy. And you're going to keep whisking until you have something that looks like this. At which point we'll stop and add the rest of the ingredients. So first up, we'll toss in a big pinch of salt. We're also going to do a little vanilla extract. And then one of the stars of the show, some almond meal, which is nothing more than finely ground almonds. And yes, you can totally make that yourself in a food processor. Although because I'm lazy, I do get mine pre-made from my friend Bob. He owns a mill. And then we're also going to need a little bit of white flour, just regular all-purpose flour. And then once all that's in, we'll go ahead and give that a mix before adding our now slightly cooled golden brown butter. So I'm going to go ahead and strain that in. And by the way, you don't have to strain it, but it's really not a bad idea. So we'll go ahead and add our butter, and we'll whisk that together. And as soon as that's all mixed together, we can go ahead and fill our muffin tins. But before we do that, let's go ahead and generously butter these. Now, what many people like to do is they will just toast a little extra butter and then just brush that melted butter into the molds. But I don't like to do that. I like to use regular unmelted butter, which I think helps prevent sticking. But as with most of my theories, I can't prove it. And then to hedge our bets, I'm going to add a pinch of flour into the bottom of each one. And once I have a little bit in each one, I'm going to go ahead and give it the old tappa. And once that gets knocked around for a few seconds, that flour is going to have coated the bottom, and we shouldn't have any problems with sticking. And then once our pan has been properly prepped, we'll go ahead and pour in our batter. And ideally, you want to fill these up just shy of the top. Okay, you don't want to fill them all the way up to the brim. But I didn't do that. Even though I know better, I filled them all the way to the top. Why? Human nature. But it's really not that big of a deal, as you'll see. And at that point, I'm going to go ahead and clean this up a little bit with a paper towel, because there's definitely going to be some drips. I find this to be one of the drippiest batters of all time. But anyway, next on the agenda is to give it yet another old tappa, and that should take care of any air bubbles. And then we will be topping these with fruit, but not quite yet. What we want to do is bake these for about 5 minutes so they get a little bit set before we try to fruit the top. So let's go ahead and transfer those into the center of a 400-degree oven for 5 minutes. And while I'm waiting, I'm going to go ahead and slice my peach. So I'm going to use a beautiful yellow peach, and I'm going to slice a wedge and take off the skin. And then all I'm going to do is make slices like this. So we really don't want too much. This is really more of a garnish. So that right there is just about the perfect amount. So I went ahead and I did 12 pieces just like that. And by this point, my Financiers have cooked for 5 minutes, and we'll pull those out. And if everything's gone according to plan, it should look something like this. And at this point, it's perfectly safe to top each one with a piece of fruit. And in case you're wondering, you could just put the fruit on at the beginning, but what's going to happen is it's going to sink down, and you won't get as nice of a presentation. And as you may know, in the world of high finance, presentation is important. And of course, if you don't like peach, you can use something else. You are the Richard Gere of your Financier, so use any fruit you like. Things like apricots, plums, blueberries, raspberries, blackberries. So really, any fruit's going to work here. Except durian. Durian stinks in this. Oh yeah, just a little smelly tropical fruit humor. And then once those are set, all we have to do is transfer those back into the oven for another about 10 to 12 minutes, or until nicely browned and looking something like this. Check it out, those don't look bad. And then what you definitely want to do is let this sit for at least 10 minutes before trying to remove them. Otherwise, there will be issues. So I did let mine cool about 10-15 minutes, at which point they were fairly easy to remove, and my peach Financiers were done. Or is it peach financier? I really should find out. You know what a stickler I am for French pronunciations. And then once those had completely cooled, I transferred them onto a serving platter and took a bunch of pictures, of course, which I'll Photoshop for the blog post. But then I quickly lost interest in the photography because I really wanted to taste one of these. And by the way, I'm really not a big almond cake guy. I mean, I love peaches. I could eat a peach for hours. But a little peach and almond cake is not necessarily something I would order. But these really are amazing. All right, the outside's kind of crisp around the edges. The inside's very rich, very buttery, very moist. And as you saw, all this was accomplished with a very, very simple recipe. So if you're one of these unfortunate souls that just never has any luck with a cookie or pastry recipe, these will work. And you can take that to the bank. So I really do hope you give these a try. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Barbecued peaches. And no, not truly barbecued. Basically grilled with barbecue sauce. This is a great way to use up those coals after you've already cooked your meat and you want to do a cool little quick side dish. This is perfect. So I'm going to start with 2 ripe freestone peaches. Okay, now there's clingstone and there's freestone. And how you know you have the right one, if I cut around and twist that pit, that stone, will come right out. The other kind don't work for stuff like this. So make sure when you're in the market, you're buying peaches, that the stone is going to come out easily. All right, make sure the produce guy or woman lets you know which variety you're looking for. So once they're halved and the stones are removed, I'm going to score them about a 1/2 inch deep in the center with my paring knife. So just 2 cuts one way, 2 cuts the other. That's going to help them cook evenly and help the sauce get down into the peach. And speaking of sauce, that's the last step. I'm going to drizzle the peaches with my favorite barbecue sauce. And if you want to know what that is, you can check out the blog post. But any sauce is going to work here. Then you're going to take a spoon or a brush and just spread it evenly, making sure it's getting down into those slashes we made. All right, and then we're heading out to the grill where we've already used the grill. We've already cooked some delicious meat or meat-like products. We're ready to eat pretty much. We're letting the meat rest. We got about 10 minutes. Let's do these peaches. So I'm going to put those skin side down over the coals, and we're just going to wait. And what we're looking for is tiny bubbles in the center of the peach. Okay, you can kind of see it there. It's not super easy to see, but if you look carefully, every once in a while, you'll see a little bubble come up. And that's the heat transferring through the peach up through those little cut marks. Okay? Now, as soon as you see that bubbling like that, you're pretty much done. You're also going to be able to tell when you go to grab these with your tongs, they're just a little bit softer than when you put them on. Okay, they're not mushy, but there's definitely a little bit of give to them. Those should be heated all the way through, and you're ready to serve. What do you serve this with? So many things. I had this amazing brined pork chop with a Carolina mustard barbecue sauce that I'm going to show you in a future video. And I paired this peach with that, and it was magnificent. Now, if you're worried about any kind of charred skin left over from the grill, you can see there, I just pulled that right off. It just peels right off. And that was such an amazing combination. Just beautiful. So like I said, you've already grilled something delicious. You're letting the meat rest. It's the middle of summer. You got some beautiful ripe peaches. Throw them on the grill. Why not? So anyway, I hope you give that a try. All the ingredients are on the site, which is peaches, barbecue sauce, and heat. But you know what? Go check out the site anyway. You'll like it. It's fun. And as always, enjoy.